The grand ceremonial hall of the Xylar Empire was designed to make even the most powerful individuals feel appropriately humbled, and it was succeeding spectacularly. Marcus Webb stood with the human delegation in a corner that was simultaneously the best view in the house and the clearest statement about humanity's place in the galactic hierarchy, visible enough to count as included, far enough from the throne to make it clear they were observers rather than players. The hall itself was breathtaking in the way that ancient architecture designed to convey absolute power tended to be. Vaulted ceilings that disappeared into orchestrated light displays, walls that seemed carved from single pieces of luminescent crystal, floor inlaid with patterns that Marcus's research suggested told the entire history of the Xylar dynasty in symbolic form. Everywhere he looked, wealth and authority radiated from the structure itself, let alone from the hundreds of nobles, diplomats, and dignitaries who filled the space in their elaborate ceremonial attire. At the center of it all, elevated on a platform that made the power dynamics absolutely clear, sat Queen Velshara on her throne of living crystal that pulsed with soft, bioluminescent light. She was imposing even by Xylar standards, tall and regal, her elongated ears adorned with delicate circlets of precious metals, her skin holding that characteristic Xylar luminescence that seemed to emanate from within. Her ceremonial robes flowed like liquid starlight, and her expression combined maternal concern with the kind of authority that came from ruling an empire, spanning multiple star systems for longer than most species maintained civilization. Beside her, in a throne that was smaller but no less elegant, sat Princess Kurethel, and Marcus had to actively prevent himself from staring the way he'd been doing for 3 years now. The princess was striking, not in the conventional sense that human beauty standards measured, but in a way that transcended species and simple aesthetics. She carried herself with the kind of confidence that came from commanding fleets and negotiating treaties, her bearing military precise but not rigid, her expression composed in that particular way that suggested someone who'd mastered the art of keeping her genuine reactions private. Her ceremonial dress was deep blue shot through with silver threads that caught the light, and her hair, darker than her mother's, almost black with that slight luminescence, was bound in an elaborate style that Marcus's research told him indicated both royal status and personal achievement in military service. But what Marcus noticed most, what he'd been noticing for 3 years of diplomatic functions and court appearances, was the subtle signs beneath the composed exterior. The slight tension around her eyes that suggested weariness with this entire process. The way her hands rested in her lap with studied casualness that was actually careful control. The micro-expression that flashed across her face when another suitor approached. Resignation mixed with the kind of polite hope that had been disappointed too many times to be genuine anymore. This was apparently the 4th time Queen Velshara had issued this particular challenge, trying to find someone worthy of marrying her daughter and heir. The previous 3 attempts had all ended similarly: elaborate ceremonies, impressive candidates, eventual failure, and Princess Kurethel remaining unmarried. Court gossip, which Marcus had gotten quite good at picking up through 3 years of careful observation and language study, suggested that the princess was either impossibly picky or cursed to remain alone, depending on which faction you listened to. The more informed gossip, the kind that came from sources closer to the royal household, suggested that Princess Kurethel was simply remarkable enough that she'd become effectively unapproachable. She'd led the successful defense of the Vrex system against raiders 2 years ago, demonstrating tactical brilliance that got studied in military academies. She'd negotiated the Kelnar trade accords, bringing together 3 feuding colonies through a combination of strategic insight and diplomatic skill that impressed even her critics. She was brilliant, formidable, accomplished, and according to the suitors who tried and failed, absolutely terrifying to actually talk to because you were constantly aware you were conversing with someone exponentially more capable than yourself. Marcus understood that feeling intimately, which was probably why he'd never attempted to actually introduce himself beyond the formal requirements of diplomatic protocol. He was a cultural attaché, technically, someone assigned to learn Xylar customs, language, and social structures so Earth could navigate this new relationship with an ancient galactic civilization without causing diplomatic incidents through ignorance. His job was to observe, report, and occasionally advise human diplomats on how to navigate Xylar political waters. His job was absolutely not to develop complicated feelings for the heir to said empire, but apparently his heart hadn't read the job description. The ceremony began with traditional formality. Queen Velshara rose, and the hall fell immediately silent. That was power, Marcus thought, when hundreds of people stopped talking simultaneously just because you stood up. Her voice when she spoke carried across the space without amplification, the Xylar vocal resonance creating harmonics that made her words feel weighted with significance. "We gather again," she announced, "to find one worthy of standing beside my daughter, Princess Kurethel, defender of Vrex, architect of the Kelnar Accords, heir to the Xylar Empire. The trials remain as before. Courage, wisdom, and honor. Those who believe themselves worthy may step forward and prove their claim." The first candidate was a Xylar military commander from one of the outer systems, decorated for valor in multiple conflicts, imposing in full ceremonial armor. He approached the throne with confidence, bowed with precise military bearing, and spoke his intention in formal language that Marcus's translation implant rendered as essentially, "I am worthy to stand beside your daughter because I am very impressive militarily." Marcus saw Princess Kurethel's expression flicker, not quite an eye roll, but close, before returning to composed neutrality. The first trial was the Velkarn, and Marcus had read about it extensively in his cultural research. It was an ancient Xylar tradition, a kind of ceremonial combat simulation that wasn't meant to test physical prowess so much as psychological strength. The simulation chamber, a spherical room that connected to the ceremonial hall, would create scenarios designed to expose the participants' deepest fears and weaknesses. It wasn't meant to be fatal, but it was meant to be revelatory. Completing it required not being fearless, but being able to face your fears without breaking. The military commander entered the chamber with confidence. 10 minutes later, he emerged pale and shaking, having apparently frozen when confronted with a simulation of losing his honor and reputation. He was escorted out with respectful ceremony, but the message was clear. Courage in actual combat didn't necessarily translate to courage when facing personal fears. The second candidate was a diplomat from a neighboring system, someone with an impressive record of negotiation and political maneuvering. He made it further than the first candidate, but ultimately collapsed when the simulation forced him to watch everyone he'd ever negotiated with claim he'd betrayed them. The third candidate, a noble with bloodlines tracing back to the founding of the empire, lasted perhaps 5 minutes before emerging in tears. And so it continued through the morning and into the afternoon. Candidate after candidate stepped forward, entered the Velkarn, and emerged defeated. Some failed through obvious panic, others through more subtle breakdowns, but they all failed. Each time, Queen Velshara's expression grew more stern, and Princess Kurethel's resigned patience became more pronounced. Marcus watched from his corner with the human delegation, taking mental notes about cultural values and social dynamics. That was his job, after all. But he was also watching Princess Kurethel, noting the subtle signs of frustration and loneliness beneath her composed exterior. He'd been doing that for 3 years now, cataloging all the small details that most people missed because they were too intimidated to look past her reputation. The way she bit her lower lip when thinking hard about something. The way her eyes tracked conversations even when she appeared to be looking elsewhere. The way she sometimes smiled at jokes others didn't catch, then suppressed the smile before anyone noticed. She was remarkable, and she was lonely. And somehow, Everyone in this hall seemed blind to the fact that those two things were connected, that her remarkable nature was what made her lonely, because people couldn't see past their intimidation to actually connect with her as a person. By late afternoon, the failures were piling up. A renowned explorer who'd mapped uncharted systems panicked when faced with being lost. A celebrated scholar broke when confronted with having all his theories proven wrong. A decorated admiral collapsed when forced to watch his fleet destroyed. Each failure was met with polite court applause and carefully neutral expressions, but Marcus could see the growing disappointment in the room. This was supposed to be a celebration, a grand event where someone finally proved worthy of the princess. Instead, it was becoming another demonstration that Princess Curethel was effectively alone, because no one could meet the standards required to stand beside her. The last candidate, a particularly pompous noble who'd spent the earlier part of the day loudly discussing his impressive qualifications, entered the Velkarn with arrogant confidence. He lasted approximately 3 minutes before stumbling out sobbing something about his investments failing. The court's polite applause was noticeably thinner this time. Queen Velshara rose from her throne, and the suppressed frustration in her bearing was visible even from Marcus's distant corner. When she spoke, her voice carried disappointment, concern, and barely contained anger. "Is there no one brave enough to marry my daughter? No one in this entire empire? No warrior, no diplomat, no noble, with the courage, wisdom, and honor required to stand beside Princess Curethel?" The silence that followed was heavy and uncomfortable. Marcus could hear people shifting in place, could feel the collective embarrassment of an entire court facing the fact that they'd failed their princess again. Could see Princess Curethel's expression settle into something that looked like resignation to permanent isolation. And something in Marcus snapped. He'd spent 3 years being professional, being appropriate, being the good cultural attaché who observed and reported and never got personally involved. He'd spent 3 years watching this remarkable woman from respectful distance, admiring her intelligence and strength, while telling himself that someone like her would never be interested in someone like him. He'd spent 3 years being safe and careful and appropriate. And in that moment, standing in the corner with the human delegation watching an entire empire fail to show basic courage, he decided that safe and careful were overrated. Marcus stepped forward. It took a moment for people to notice. He was just one human among many beings starting from the margins of the hall. But as he walked steadily toward the throne, conversation stopped. Heads turned. The human delegation made surprised noises that Marcus ignored, because if he thought about what he was doing for even a moment, he'd lose his nerve entirely. He reached the clear space before the throne and stopped at the appropriate distance. He'd memorized all the court protocols, that much his job had prepared him for. Then he executed what he hoped was a proper bow, looked up at Queen Velshara's shocked expression, and before he could talk himself out of it, said in carefully practiced Xyler, "Your Majesty, I volunteer to attempt the trials." The silence was absolute. Then the court erupted in murmurs, confused, amused, intrigued. Marcus kept his eyes on Queen Velshara, refusing to let himself look at Princess Curethel because if he saw her expression right now, he might actually pass out from nerves. Queen Velshara stared at him for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice carried surprise and something that might have been curiosity. "You are Marcus Webb, human cultural attaché. You've been on our world for 3 years studying our civilization." It wasn't a question, but Marcus nodded confirmation anyway. "You understand what you're volunteering for. The trials are not symbolic. They are designed to test the worthiest candidates of ancient civilizations. Many have failed. Some have been injured. What makes you, a human, a species barely into spaceflight, believe you could succeed where decorated generals and celebrated diplomats have fallen?" Marcus took a breath, aware that every eye in the hall was on him, that he was probably about to destroy his diplomatic career and become a cautionary tale about humans overestimating themselves. but he'd already stepped forward. "Might as well commit." "Your Majesty," he said, and was pleased that his voice came out steady despite his racing heart. "I don't know if I'll succeed. I probably won't if I'm being honest. But I heard your question. Is there no one brave enough? And I couldn't let it stand unanswered." He finally let himself look at Princess Curethel, who was staring at him with wide eyes and an expression of genuine shock. "I've spent 3 years on your world, learning your language, studying your customs, attending court functions. I've watched Princess Curethel navigate impossible political situations with grace, defend her positions with brilliant arguments, and show compassion to those who wouldn't expect it from someone of her station. She's remarkable." His voice strengthened as he continued, because this part at least was absolutely true. "And if no one else in this entire hall has the courage to step forward and attempt to prove themselves worthy of someone that remarkable, then I will. Because she deserves at least one person who's willing to try." The silence that followed felt different, less shocked, more thoughtful. Marcus waited, still not quite believing he'd actually done this, while Queen Velshara studied him with an expression he couldn't read. Then, unexpectedly, Princess Curethel spoke for the first time that day, her voice carrying clearly across the hall. "You've been watching me for 3 years." Marcus felt his face heat, observing professionally. "For cultural research purposes." He paused. That sounded significantly less creepy in my head. A ripple of surprised laughter ran through the court. Apparently humans making fools of themselves was universally entertaining. But Princess Curethel's expression had shifted from shock to something that looked like genuine interest, and Queen Velshara's stern demeanor had cracked slightly into what might have been amusement. "Very well," the Queen said, her voice formal but carrying an undertone of curiosity. "Marcus Webb of Earth, you may attempt the trials. The first is courage. You will face the Velkarn. It will find your deepest fears and force you to confront them. If you survive with your mind intact, we will proceed to the trials of wisdom and honor. If you fail, you may leave this hall with our respect for attempting what others would not dare." Marcus bowed again, still not quite believing this was happening. "Thank you, Your Majesty. I'll do my best not to embarrass humanity too badly." "Too late," someone from the human delegation called out, probably Davidson, who had a terrible sense of timing, and the court laughed again. But Princess Curethel was smiling now, small but genuine, and Marcus thought that even if he failed spectacularly in the next few minutes, seeing that smile made it worth it. The Velkarn chamber door opened, and Marcus walked toward it, toward whatever fears the ancient simulation would dig up, toward either triumph or humiliating failure. But he was walking forward, which was more than anyone else had been brave enough to do. And as the door sealed behind him and the white space of the simulation chamber surrounded him, Marcus's last thought before the test began was that Princess Curethel deserved someone willing to try. Even if that someone was just a human cultural attaché who'd finally run out of patience for staying safely in his corner. The Velkarn chamber was pure white when Marcus entered, empty and featureless. The kind of blank space that made distance impossible to judge and gave his eyes nothing to focus on. He'd read descriptions of this in his research, accounts from candidates who'd faced it in previous ceremonies, but reading about sensory disorientation and actually experiencing it were entirely different things. For several long seconds, Marcus stood in the white nothing, his heartbeat loud in his ears, wondering if the simulation had malfunctioned or if the waiting itself was part of the test. Then the white flickered, and he was somewhere else entirely. The transition was seamless and disorienting. One moment empty space. The next moment he was standing in what looked like a conference room back on Earth, facing a panel of stern-faced officers from Earth Command. They looked real, solid, absolutely convincing down to the coffee stains on the table and the way afternoon light slanted through windows. Marcus's rational brain insisted this wasn't real, that he was still in the Velkarn chamber being subjected to a simulation designed to exploit his psychological weaknesses. But the primitive parts of his brain that handled fight-or-flight responses didn't care about rational understanding. They were informing him urgently that he was in trouble. "Attaché Webb," the central figure said. Admiral Morrison, Marcus recognized. Someone he'd actually reported to during his first year on the Xylar homeworld. The simulation had gotten her voice exactly right. That particular tone of disappointment mixed with authority that she wielded like a precision instrument. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Marcus tried to respond, but his voice came out rough. "This isn't real. You're not actually here. This is the Velkarn simulation." "The simulation." Morrison leaned forward, and her expression was withering. "You volunteered to attempt the Xylar princess trials in front of their entire court. You made humanity look like arrogant fools presuming we're on equal footing with civilizations that were building star bridges while we were still discovering fire. You've single-handedly set back diplomatic relations by decades because you couldn't keep your inappropriate feelings for an alien princess under control." The words hit harder than they should because they articulated fears Marcus had been suppressing, that he was being selfish, that his actions would have consequences beyond himself, that he was jeopardizing something larger out of personal desire. Another figure at the table spoke. Chen, the senior cultural officer who trained Marcus before his assignment. "We sent you to observe, Webb, to learn, to help humanity navigate a relationship with the Xylar without causing incidents. Instead, you turned yourself into the incident. You've made us all look like we can't maintain professional boundaries, like we're so starstruck by alien civilization that we lose all sense of appropriate behavior." Marcus started, but Morrison cut him off. "You'll be recalled immediately, stripped of your position, sent back to Earth in disgrace, and every human diplomat trying to build relationships with the Xylar will have to work twice as hard to overcome the damage you've caused. Was it worth it, Attaché? Was your romantic fantasy worth destroying your career and embarrassing your entire species?" The simulation was vicious and specific, designed to hit every insecurity Marcus carried about his decision. And it was working. He could feel panic rising, could feel the familiar weight of imposter syndrome crushing down, the certainty that he'd overstepped and caused damage he couldn't repair. But then something Princess Kurethel had said during a diplomatic function months ago surfaced in his memory. Marcus had been observing a negotiation between Xylar and a client species, where the client representatives kept apologizing for taking up valuable time, kept deferring to Xylar authority even when they had legitimate grievances. Afterward, during the social portion of the function, Princess Kurethel had been discussing the negotiation with her advisors, and Marcus had overheard her say, "Fear of failure only controls you if you believe failure defines you." They negotiated poorly because they were so afraid of making mistakes that they couldn't advocate for their actual interests. Every attempt teaches you something, even if it doesn't succeed. Marcus took a breath and looked at the simulated Admiral Morrison. "You're right. I might fail. This might be a terrible decision that damages diplomatic relations and makes humanity look arrogant. But the princess deserves someone willing to try, even if trying means risking failure. And if that makes me foolish or inappropriate, I'll accept that judgment." He looked around the simulated conference room, at the disappointed faces of people he respected. "But I'd rather be recalled in disgrace for having the courage to attempt something difficult than stay safely in my position by never taking any risks." Princess Kurethel asked if anyone was brave enough, and everyone stayed silent because they were afraid of exactly this, of being judged for trying and failing. "If my failure teaches other humans not to let fear of judgment prevent them from being brave, then maybe it's worth it." The simulation flickered, the conference room wavering like a mirage. For a moment Marcus saw through to the white space of the chamber beneath, then a new scenario solidified around him. This time it was physical danger. He was back in the Velkarn, but now the space was collapsing, walls closing in from all sides, the ceiling descending to crush him. His body reacted with instinctive panic, adrenaline flooding his system, breath coming short. This was ancient fear, the primal terror of being trapped and crushed. Marcus's hands were shaking, his heart racing so hard he thought it might actually escape his chest. But he forced himself to think through the terror. This wasn't real, the walls weren't actually closing. He was in a simulation designed to trigger fear responses and measure how he handled them. He couldn't stop being afraid. The simulation was too good, too viscerally convincing. But he could choose how he responded to the fear. "I'm terrified," Marcus said aloud to the empty simulation, his voice shaking. "This is triggering every claustrophobic instinct I have. My body wants me to panic, but panicking won't help. So I'm going to stand here, acknowledge that I'm scared, and wait for this to pass because that's all I can do." The walls continued closing, the space becoming tighter, and Marcus had to actively fight the urge to collapse or scream or try to physically push against the simulation. He closed his eyes, which somehow made it slightly better because he wasn't watching his doom approach, and focused on breathing. In, out, regular, controlled, terrified but functional. The ceiling touched his head. Marcus flinched but held his ground. The walls were against his shoulders now, and every instinct screamed at him to do something, anything, to escape. But he'd committed to staying, to not letting the fear control his actions even if he couldn't control the fear itself. "Still scared," he said, because talking seemed to help. "Still standing, still breathing. That's all I've got, but apparently it's enough." The simulation released him abruptly, the crushing walls vanishing back into white space. Marcus stumbled, catching himself before he fell, breathing hard and shaking. 2 scenarios down, probably more to come. The Velkarn cycled through fears rapidly. Marcus remembered from his research. The goal wasn't just to terrify you with one thing, but to see how you handled multiple types of fear in succession, testing psychological resilience through variety. The next scenario manifested as people he loved, his sister back on Earth, his parents, friends he'd left behind when he accepted this assignment. They were all looking at him with expressions ranging from disappointment to hurt to anger. "You chose alien strangers over your family," his sister said, and the simulation had gotten her voice heartbreakingly accurate. "You've been gone 3 years, Marcus. You barely communicate anymore. We hear about you through official channels. Learn you're volunteering for alien marriage trials from news reports. Did we stop mattering to you?" This one cut deeper, because it had truth mixed with the simulation's manipulation. Marcus had been distant, had let his work consume him, had used the excuse of different time zones and busy schedules to avoid difficult conversations about why he'd chosen a career that took him across the galaxy. "You're right," Marcus said, and his voice was thick. "I have been distant. I've used my work as an excuse to avoid dealing with the fact that I left Earth partly because I didn't know how to fit there. That's on me, not you. But I didn't stop caring about you just because I'm physically far away." He looked at the simulation of his sister. "And I volunteered for the trials because I saw someone remarkable and lonely, and I couldn't stand watching everyone be too afraid to reach out. That doesn't mean you stopped mattering. It means I finally found something that mattered enough to take a risk for. I'm sorry if that hurts you, but I can't apologize for being brave." The scenario shifted again, cycling through more fears. Professional inadequacy, where he faced a simulation of Princess Kurethel telling him he wasn't nearly as impressive as he thought. Social humiliation, where the entire Xylar court mocked him for presuming he could be worthy. Physical danger again, this time falling endlessly through empty space. Each scenario hit a different psychological pressure point, and each time Marcus had to find a way to face it without completely breaking. He was exhausted, shaking, emotionally wrung out, cycling between terror and determination and the kind of raw honesty that came from having no energy left for pretense. But he kept standing, kept responding, kept acknowledging his fears without letting them dictate his choices. The Velkarn wasn't looking for fearlessness. From what Marcus understood, Anyone who showed no fear at all would likely be flagged as either psychologically abnormal or lying convincingly enough to fool the simulation, neither of which were desirable traits in a potential spouse for the princess. The simulation was looking for people who could face their fears honestly and keep functioning anyway. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably closer to 20 minutes, the simulation scenarios stopped cycling. Marcus stood in white space again, breathing hard, sweat soaking through his formal attire, his hands still trembling from the adrenaline that had no outlet. He'd survived. Or he'd failed, but the simulation was being polite about letting him exit. Hard to tell. The chamber door opened. Light from the ceremonial hall spilled in, and Marcus walked toward it on unsteady legs, squinting against the brightness. He emerged into the hall and had to pause for a moment, letting his eyes adjust, trying to get his breathing under control before he faced the court again. There was absolute silence. Marcus finally managed to focus on the assembled crowd and saw expressions ranging from shocked to impressed to confused. No one was laughing this time. No one looked amused by the human making a fool of himself. Instead, they looked like they were reassessing something they'd written off as ridiculous. Queen Velshara was standing now, her expression unreadable but intent. Princess Kurethel was also standing, having apparently abandoned her composed seat beside her mother's throne, and the look on her face was complex: surprise, respect, something that might have been hope. "How long?" Marcus asked, his voice still rough from the scenarios where he'd been shouting or crying. "How long was I in there?" 23 minutes, Queen Velshara replied. "You lasted longer than any candidate today. Longer than most candidates from previous ceremonies." She studied him with renewed interest. "You faced the Velkarn with honesty rather than bravado. You acknowledged your fears instead of denying them. That takes a particular kind of courage. The courage to be vulnerable rather than the courage to pretend invulnerability." Marcus swayed slightly, exhaustion catching up with him now that the immediate threat had passed. "With respect, Your Majesty, I'm not feeling particularly courageous right now. I'm feeling like I might need to sit down before I fall down." That got a ripple of sympathetic laughter from the court. Apparently nearly collapsing after surviving a psychological gauntlet was relatable even across species. One of the court officials hurried forward with a chair, which Marcus accepted gratefully, sitting heavily and trying to stop his hands from shaking. Princess Kurethel approached, and Marcus made himself focus despite the exhaustion clouding his thoughts. Up close, she was even more striking than from a distance, her luminescent skin catching the hall's lighting in subtle patterns, her eyes, deep violet. He noticed now, fixed on him with an intensity that made his tired heart speed up again. "That was brave," she said simply. "Foolish potentially, but brave." "Foolish is kind of my specialty," Marcus managed, "along with inappropriate timing and questionable life choices." "You completed the trial of courage," Queen Velshara announced, her voice carrying across the hall. "You have earned the right to attempt the trial of wisdom. However, you are clearly exhausted. We will adjourn until tomorrow to allow you to recover. The trial of wisdom requires mental clarity, which you understandably lack at this moment." "Appreciated," Marcus said, because trying to tackle whatever the wisdom trial involved while he could barely think straight seemed like a recipe for disaster. "Thank you, Your Majesty." "Do not thank me yet," Queen Velshara replied, but there was a hint of something approving in her tone. "The wisdom trial has ended many candidates who passed courage. Rest well, Marcus Webb. You will need your full faculties tomorrow." The ceremony was officially adjourned. Court officials began dispersing, conversations erupting across the hall about the human who'd survived the Velkarn. Marcus sat in his chair, too tired to move immediately, while the human delegation descended on him with a mix of concern, confusion, and what looked like impressed disbelief. "Webb, what the hell were you thinking?" Davidson demanded, though he was grinning. "You just volunteered to marry an alien princess in front of half the Xylar Empire." "Wasn't thinking," Marcus admitted. That was kind of the point. If I'd thought about it, I wouldn't have done it. "The Earth Command is going to have opinions," another attaché said. "Strong opinions, probably delivered at high volume." "Future Marcus's problem," Marcus replied. "Present Marcus needs to sleep for approximately 16 hours. But before he could stand, before the delegation could escort him away, Princess Curethel returned, having apparently extricated herself from her own crowd of advisors. She looked at Marcus with that complex expression again, and when she spoke, her voice was quiet enough that only he and maybe the nearest few people could hear. "You said you've been watching me for 3 years. That you noticed things about me others missed." She paused. "I noticed you too, 3 years ago at the trade negotiations. You laughed at my quantum mechanics joke when everyone else looked confused. I've been hoping you'd talk to me ever since." Marcus blinked, processing that through the exhaustion fog. "You're telling me I could have just introduced myself like a normal person instead of volunteering for terrifying trials? Where would be the fun in that?" Princess Curethel said, and her smile was genuine and warm and made every minute of terror in the Velkarn suddenly seem worth it. "Besides, now I know you're brave. Get some rest, Marcus Webb. Tomorrow we find out if you're wise." She returned to her mother's side, and Marcus let the human delegation guide him out of the hall, toward the quarters they'd been provided in the diplomatic wing. His mind was spinning too fast for his exhausted body to keep up, but one thought kept circling back. Princess Curethel had noticed him, had been hoping he'd talk to her, had apparently spent 3 years aware of his existence, while he'd been carefully observing from respectful distance thinking he was being subtle. "This is either the best or worst decision I've ever made," Marcus said to no one in particular as they reached his quarters. "Given that you survived when decorated warriors didn't," Davidson replied, "I'm leaning toward best, but ask me again after the wisdom trial." Marcus collapsed onto his bed, human designed but incorporating some Xylar elements, and despite his racing thoughts, exhaustion won. He was asleep within minutes, his dreams full of white spaces, closing walls, and violet eyes that saw through every defense he'd ever tried to construct. Tomorrow he'd face wisdom. Tonight he'd survived courage. And somewhere in the palace, Princess Curethel was going to bed thinking about the human who'd finally been brave enough to step forward, and wondering if maybe, finally, someone had seen her as a person worth the risk. Marcus woke to sunlight streaming through windows designed for Xylar circadian rhythms, which meant he'd overslept significantly by human standards, but felt more rested than he had any right to given yesterday's events. For approximately 30 blissful seconds, he lay in bed thinking this was just another day of cultural attaché duties, before memory crashed back, and he sat up abruptly with the realization that today he was supposed to demonstrate wisdom to an alien empire that had been practicing philosophy when humanity was still figuring out agriculture. No pressure. His communication device, a hybrid of human and Xylar technology that he still found slightly unnerving because it grew organically rather than being manufactured, was flashing with what looked like several dozen messages. Marcus scrolled through them. Earth Command demanding immediate reports and threatening recalls, his family asking if he'd lost his mind, colleagues ranging from supportive to baffled, and one message from Princess Curethel's private office providing timing and location for today's trial, along with a note that simply said, "Good luck. Be yourself." Be himself. Right. The version of himself that had survived psychological torture yesterday through stubborn honesty and inappropriate jokes. Marcus could work with that. He went through his morning routine on autopilot, dressed in formal attire that the human delegation had provided. Apparently someone had anticipated he might need to look presentable for multiple days of this, and made his way to the designated location. The wisdom trial was being held in a smaller chamber than yesterday's massive ceremonial hall, which Marcus initially found reassuring before realizing that smaller was relative when dealing with Xylar architecture. The room was still impressive, circular with a domed ceiling, furnished with elegant seating arranged in a configuration that suggested this was where serious deliberations happened. Queen Velshara was present, along with Princess Kurethel, and what looked like a council of senior advisors, older Xylar whose luminescence had faded to softer hues, suggesting advanced age and accumulated authority. Marcus executed what he hoped was appropriate greeting protocol and took the seat indicated, positioned across from the council with Princess Kurethel and her mother slightly to the side, close enough to participate but not directly in the configuration. The trial of wisdom, Queen Velshara began without preamble, is not a test of intelligence or knowledge, which can be measured through simpler means. It is a test of judgment, insight, and the ability to see beyond the obvious to understand what truly matters. You will be presented with a political scenario, a real one that we faced several years ago, though you would have no way of knowing the outcome. Your task is to propose a solution that demonstrates strategic thinking, cultural awareness, and genuine wisdom. She gestured, and a holographic display materialized in the center of the room, showing star charts, population data, resource distribution, and what looked like diplomatic correspondence. Two of our colony systems, Vrindle and Kelnar, were on the brink of war over disputed resource distribution in shared space. Both had legitimate historical claims. Both had growing populations in need of those resources. Both had powerful allies who would be drawn into any conflict. Previous mediators had attempted forced arbitration, equitable redistribution, and military intervention as deterrent. All failed. The colonies continued escalating toward violence. Marcus studied the display, noting details, trying to get his head around a problem that entire councils of experienced diplomats had apparently failed to solve. What's the time frame I'm working with? How long did the actual crisis last before it was resolved? One of the senior advisors raised what looked like an eyebrow. The gesture translated well enough across species. You wish to know the constraints. I wish to know whether this is an immediate crisis requiring fast action or a long-term problem requiring sustained effort, Marcus clarified. Because those require fundamentally different approaches. 3 months, Queen Velshara said, from crisis point to stable resolution, though tensions had been building for years prior. Marcus nodded, continuing to examine the data. The obvious solutions jumped out immediately. Force the colonies to share equally, establish buffer zones, deploy military presence to prevent violence. But those were the solutions that had apparently already failed, and Marcus was pretty sure the point of this trial wasn't to propose the obvious. May I ask questions about the scenario, or am I supposed to work only with what's displayed? Questions are permitted, Princess Kurethel said, and Marcus thought he detected approval in her voice. Wisdom often begins with knowing what you don't know. Okay, first question. Who discovered the disputed resources initially? Is there a historical record of first claim? The advisors exchanged glances, and one replied. Vrindle colony ships first mapped the resources approximately 80 years ago. But Kelnar colony was established in the region first, 50 years before that, though they lacked the technology to detect or extract those particular resources at the time. Second question. What were the original agreements when both colonies were established? Was there a framework for handling shared space? There were general guidelines about cooperation, another advisor said, but nothing specific to this resource type, which wasn't relevant when the colonies were founded. Third question. What do the people in both colonies actually want? Not what their governments are demanding in negotiations, but what the civilian populations care about. That question got interesting reactions. Some advisors looked confused by the distinction, others looked intrigued. Princess Kurethel leaned forward slightly, clearly paying close attention now. Queen Velshara gestured for one of her advisors to respond. Survey data suggested both populations were primarily concerned with economic stability and growth opportunities. The resources were important because they enabled that growth, but the populations weren't inherently hostile to each other. That was driven more by political leadership framing it as us versus them. Fourth question: are there cultural or historical factors that make cooperation difficult between these specific colonies? Religious differences, historical conflicts, incompatible social structures. No significant cultural barriers, an advisor replied. Both colonies were founded by similar demographic groups, share most cultural practices and values. The conflict is genuinely about resource distribution, not deeper incompatibilities. Marcus sat back, processing. The other candidates had apparently jumped straight to solutions without this preliminary investigation, which explained why their solutions had been found wanting. But Marcus's entire career was built on asking questions first, on recognizing that the stated problem often wasn't the actual problem. Fifth question, he said, looking directly at Princess Curethel now. What solution was actually implemented? I'm not asking because I want to copy it. I'm asking because knowing what worked tells me what I'm missing in my analysis. Princess Curethel smiled, and several advisors looked startled that he'd asked that directly. I proposed granting both colonies greater autonomy and representation in regional governance, establishing a joint colonial council with real decision-making authority over resource allocation, transforming the conflict from competing claims to collaborative development. And the council rejected it initially, Marcus guessed, called it naive idealism, Curethel confirmed. Too slow, too risky, too much faith in cooperation. They wanted a fast solution that would settle the dispute definitively. Marcus turned back to the display, the pieces clicking together. Right. So the problem isn't actually about resources. It's about respect and recognition. Both colonies feel dismissed, Vrindle because their discovery claim isn't being honored, Kelnar because their earlier establishment is being overlooked. The resources are the flashpoint, but the underlying issue is that both feel like the central government doesn't value them or their contributions. He looked around at the council. Any solution that focuses purely on splitting the resources will fail, because it doesn't address what both colonies actually need: to feel heard and valued by the larger empire. So my proposal is similar to what Princess Curethel suggested, not because I'm trying to flatter her, but because it's the right approach. Give both colonies greater autonomy. Establish a joint council with genuine authority. Transform them from rivals competing for central government favor into partners with shared stakes in regional success. That's not a quick solution, one of the advisors objected. It requires years of trust building and institutional development. Yes, Marcus agreed, because quick solutions to deep problems usually just create new problems. You can force a temporary peace through resource distribution or military pressure. But unless you address the underlying need for recognition and autonomy, the conflict will just resurface over the next disputed issue. Real wisdom is recognizing when the obvious solution won't actually work, and being willing to invest in something harder but more sustainable. The silence that followed felt different from yesterday's shocked reaction. This was more thoughtful, evaluative. Queen Velshara exchanged looks with her senior advisors, and Marcus couldn't read their expressions well enough to know if he'd passed or failed spectacularly. Finally, one of the oldest advisors spoke, her voice carrying the weight of centuries. That is precisely what Princess Curethel proposed 3 years ago. We rejected it as too idealistic, too human-influenced in its emphasis on bottom-up governance rather than top-down control. We insisted on implementing a forced resource split backed by military presence. It failed within 6 months. Tensions escalated to actual violence, and we lost lives before finally implementing Princess Curethel's original proposal, which has maintained stable peace since. The advisor looked at Marcus with something that might have been respect. You reached the same conclusion through different reasoning, by asking what people actually needed rather than what they claimed to want, by recognizing that wisdom sometimes means choosing the harder path, by understanding that quick fixes to complex problems are usually illusions. Queen Velshara rose. You have passed the trial of wisdom, Marcus Webb. Not by displaying superior intelligence, but by demonstrating judgment and the willingness to question assumptions. One trial remains, honor, and for that you will speak with my daughter privately. What she asks of you, and how you answer will determine whether you have proven yourself worthy to stand beside her. The council filed out, leaving Marcus alone with Princess Curethel in the chamber. The shift from formal trial to private conversation was disorienting. One moment he was being evaluated by an empire's leadership. The next, he was just sitting across from the woman he'd been admiring from respectful distance for 3 years. Curethel moved to sit closer, not quite beside him but near enough that this felt like an actual conversation rather than an interrogation. "We can go somewhere more comfortable if you prefer," she said. "There's a garden courtyard nearby that's private and considerably less intimidating than a council chamber." "That sounds perfect," Marcus agreed, and followed her through corridors of living crystal until they emerged into a space that took his breath away. The garden was small by palace standards, but lush with bioluminescent plants creating patterns of soft light, water features that sounded like quiet music, seating carved from stone that had been shaped by growth rather than tools. The air smelled like the Xylar equivalent of flowers, sweet, but with an underlying sharpness that was distinctly alien. They sat on a bench positioned near one of the water features, and for a moment neither spoke, just existing in the garden's peace after the intensity of trials. Finally, Princess Curethel turned to face him directly, and her expression was open in a way it hadn't been in the formal settings. "The trial of honor is simple but difficult. I'm going to ask you why you're really doing this, and you're going to tell me the truth. Not the courtly version you told my mother. Not the version that makes you sound noble and selfless. The actual truth about why you volunteered." Marcus took a breath, gathering courage. "Because I was angry. I watched you sit there all day maintaining perfect composure while suitor after suitor failed or withdrew, and I watched your mother ask if anyone was brave enough, and I saw the entire court stay silent. And I thought about how lonely that must be, to be so accomplished that you've become unapproachable, so impressive that you've become isolated." He met her eyes. "I stepped forward because someone should have. Because you deserve to have people try, even if they fail. Because being brave enough to be vulnerable in front of someone remarkable is its own kind of honor, and I was tired of watching everyone choose safety over courage." "And," Curethel prompted softly, "that's truth, but it's not the whole truth." Marcus felt his face heat. "And because I've been half in love with you for 3 years, and I was tired of pretending that professional distance was sustainable. Because watching you from across ceremonial halls was making me miserable. Because I wanted a chance to actually know you as a person, instead of just admiring you from careful remove. Because I'm apparently incapable of being sensible when it comes to you." The silence stretched and Marcus couldn't read her expression. Then Princess Curethel did something unexpected. She laughed, genuine and bright. "Finally. Someone being honest instead of performing nobility. Do you know how exhausting it is having every suitor pretend they're motivated purely by honor and duty? As if romantic interest is somehow shameful or needs to be hidden behind impressive rhetoric." She shifted closer. "You said you've been watching me for 3 years, observing professionally. What else did you notice besides the obvious accomplishments everyone knows about?" "That you're funny," Marcus said, committing fully to honesty now. "You made that quantum mechanics joke during trade negotiations and no one laughed because they were too intimidated, but it was genuinely clever. That you care about people most wouldn't notice. I saw you thank a servant by name during a formal dinner, which no one else did. That you bite your lower lip when you're thinking hard about something, which is endearing and probably not something you want people noticing in court. That you're lonely, which I recognize because I am too. He looked at her directly. That you're brilliant and formidable, and also just a person trying to figure out how to connect with others when your reputation precedes you everywhere. That underneath all the accomplishments and authority, you're someone who deserves to be seen as more than just impressive credentials. Curathel's expression had softened into something vulnerable. You see me, not the warrior princess or the brilliant diplomat or the heir to the empire, just me. Do you know how rare that is? I imagine very rare, Marcus said. Which is why you've been lonely despite being surrounded by people constantly. Because they're all relating to your role rather than to you as a person. And you think you're different. Curethel asked, but it wasn't challenging, more like hoping. I think I'd like the chance to try, Marcus said. I'm not saying I'm automatically better at seeing past reputations. I spent 3 years being too intimidated to actually introduce myself, so clearly I'm not immune to that. But I'm saying I'm interested in knowing Curethel the person, not just Princess Curethel the legend. And I'm brave enough, or foolish enough, to have stepped forward and admitted that in front of your entire court. Curethel was quiet for a long moment, her luminescent skin catching the garden light in patterns that Marcus was learning indicated emotional depth. I have one more question. This isn't part of the formal trial, but I need to know. What happens after? If I accept your suit, if we pursue this, what are you expecting? Because being married to the heir of the Xylar Empire isn't like human romantic fantasies. There will be political pressure, cultural scrutiny, people who think you're not worthy regardless of what trials you pass. It will be complicated and difficult, and sometimes Daughter, you pass the trial of honor through vulnerability and genuine admission of your motivations and limitations. She paused and Marcus tried to read her expression, approval, concern, maternal protectiveness. Possibly all three simultaneously. However, the Queen continued, completing the trials does not automatically result in marriage. That decision rests entirely with Princess Curethel. The trials merely demonstrate that you meet minimum standards of courage, wisdom, and honor. Whether you are the right choice for my daughter specifically is for her to determine. Marcus felt his heart hammering, very aware that he was still holding Curethel's hand in front of her mother and the entire senior council. Queen Velshara turned to her daughter, her expression softening slightly. Curethel, what is your judgment? Princess Curethel stepped forward slightly, addressing the council formally but with warmth underneath the protocol. Marcus Webb is either remarkably brave or spectacularly foolish, and I suspect it's both simultaneously. He completed trials designed to break seasoned warriors and experienced diplomats with nothing but honesty, inappropriate humor, and stubborn refusal to quit. He answered the wisdom trial by essentially agreeing with me, which shows either excellent judgment or fortunate coincidence. That got some quiet laughter from the advisors. And in the trial of honor, he admitted he has no idea what he's doing, and is mostly improvising based on genuine feelings rather than strategic calculation. She turned to look at Marcus directly, and her expression was warm and vulnerable and hopeful. He's also the first person in years who's bothered to notice me as a person rather than a collection of accomplishments, who saw past my reputation to recognize that I'm lonely and funny and human, or the Xylar equivalent, beneath all the impressive credentials. Who was brave enough to step forward when everyone else chose safety? Who made me laugh during formal trials, which I didn't think was possible? Curethel addressed her mother directly now. So here is my judgment, mother. I accept Marcus Webb's suit. Not because he completed the trials perfectly. He didn't. Not because he's the most impressive candidate by conventional measures. He's absolutely not. But because he completed them authentically. Because he was willing to be vulnerable and honest instead of performing invulnerability. Because he sees me. And because I've been hoping for 3 years that he'd actually talk to me instead of just observing from respectful distance. Queen Velshara's expression cycled through several emotions too quickly for Marcus to track, landing on something that looked like resigned amusement mixed with genuine happiness. Very well. If my daughter accepts you, Marcus Webb, then the Xylar Empire acknowledges you as worthy. You will be formally bonded according to our traditions, which will require extensive ceremonies, political negotiations, and probably more trials of various kinds. Are you prepared for that? Not even slightly, Marcus admitted, because apparently honesty was working so far. But I'm willing to learn, and I suspect Princess Curethel will be excellent at guiding me through everything I'm about to get wrong. You suspect correctly, Curethel said, squeezing his hand. I've had decades of practice navigating palace politics. You'll need approximately all of that expertise. What followed was bureaucracy, complex, elaborate, time-consuming bureaucracy that apparently accompanied every major royal decision. Forms that needed completion, ceremonies that required scheduling, political implications that demanded navigation. Marcus signed things in languages he barely understood, made promises in customs he was still learning, and basically agreed to whatever the advisors said was necessary while trying to look like he knew what he was doing. Through it all, Curethel stayed beside him, occasionally translating nuance his implant missed, warning him which ceremonies were actually important versus which were pure pageantry, and making dry observations about how ridiculous some of the requirements were. Marcus discovered that having her there made the overwhelming experience manageable, not easy, but navigable with someone who understood both the system and him. The formal bonding ceremony was scheduled for 3 days hence. Apparently that was rushing it by Xylar standards, but Queen Velshara had decreed that if her daughter had finally accepted someone, they weren't going to risk him changing his mind or Earth Command, successfully recalling him before the bond was official. Marcus found it simultaneously flattering and terrifying that the Queen thought those were genuine risks. In the brief spaces between official duties and ceremonial preparations, Marcus and Curethel found moments for actual conversation, real talking, getting to know each other beyond the carefully observed distance of the previous 3 years. They discovered shared frustration with bureaucracy, shared terrible senses of humor, shared experience of feeling like outsiders looking in on their own societies. Curethel told him about the loneliness of being heir, about making decisions that affected billions while having no one to share the weight with. Marcus told her about choosing xenoanthropology as a way to understand cultures from outside, because he'd never quite felt like he fit inside his own. They found common ground in unexpected places. Both loved old music from their respective cultures. Both had complicated relationships with their families. Both were more comfortable with ideas and books than with large social gatherings. And they learned each other's tells. Marcus ran his hand through his hair when nervous. Curethel bit her lip when thinking. Both of them defaulted to humor when overwhelmed. The formal bonding ceremony, when it finally happened, was elaborate enough to make Marcus's head spin. The grand ceremonial hall was even more impressive than during the trials, decorated with bioluminescent displays that created patterns in the air, filled with what felt like every noble and diplomat in the empire, orchestrated with precision that suggested this had been practiced extensively. Marcus wore formal human attire that had been adapted slightly for Xylar aesthetics. Apparently, the diplomatic corps had anticipated this possibility enough to have appropriate clothing prepared, which suggested they'd had more faith in him than he'd had in himself. Curethel wore ceremonial robes in deep purple and silver that seemed to shift and move independently, responding to her emotional state in ways that made her look like she was wearing starlight. The ceremony itself involved extensive rituals that Marcus mostly followed by watching Curethel and copying her gestures, while trying not to obviously have no idea what he was doing. There were blessings from council members, formal recognition from Queen Velshara, exchange of tokens that symbolized various commitments Marcus, didn't fully understand but accepted anyway. Through it all, the hall full of Xylar nobility and human diplomatic delegation watched with expressions ranging from approval to skepticism, to barely concealed curiosity about how a human cultural attaché had ended up here. But the moment that actually mattered, the part Marcus would remember later, came near the end when he and Kurethel faced each other for the personal vows portion. The formal words had been spoken, the official bond recognized, but Xylar tradition also included space for personal statement, not required but significant if offered. Kurethel spoke first, her voice clear and carrying. "I choose you not because you completed trials but because you saw me. Not the princess or the warrior or the heir but Kurethel. You were brave enough to step forward when everyone else was too intimidated or too careful. You made me laugh during formal trials and admitted you were terrified while refusing to quit. You're honest and stubborn and probably going to make dozens of embarrassing cultural mistakes." That got quiet laughter from the assembled crowd. "But you're also kind and thoughtful and willing to be vulnerable, which turns out to be more important than being impressive. Thank you for stepping forward, for being brave when everyone chose safety, for seeing me." Then it was Marcus's turn, and he'd prepared nothing, figuring that since honesty had worked so far, he might as well continue. "I spent 3 years watching you and being too intimidated to actually talk to you like a normal person. I convinced myself that respectful distance was professional, when really it was cowardice. And when I finally did step forward, it wasn't because I suddenly became brave. It was because I was tired of watching you be lonely and isolated while everyone stayed silent." He took her hands, very aware that hundreds of people were watching but trying to speak to her rather than to the crowd. "I still don't know what I'm doing. I'm going to make mistakes, commit cultural errors, probably accidentally insult someone important. I'm going to need so much guidance navigating palace life and Xylar customs that you'll get tired of explaining things. But I promise I'll keep seeing you, not your title or accomplishments or political position, but you. The person who makes quantum mechanics jokes and cares about people others don't notice. The person who's brilliant and formidable, and also lonely and funny, and deserves someone willing to be brave enough to actually try." The ceremony concluded with final blessings and formal recognition, and then, finally, they were allowed to retreat from the public spectacle. The celebrations would continue for hours, the political implications would ripple for months, but Marcus and Kurethel were granted the grace of retiring to private quarters before the feast began. In the quiet of what were now technically their shared chambers, a suite of rooms that made Marcus's previous diplomatic quarters look like a closet, they collapsed onto elegant furniture and just breathed for a moment. "We did it," Kurethel said, sounding slightly disbelieving. "We actually went through with it. You're officially my bonded partner, and I'm officially married to a human cultural attaché who volunteered on impulse without thinking through any of the implications." "Is this where you admit you've made a terrible mistake?" Marcus asked, half joking but half genuinely worried. "This is where I admit I'm terrified and happy in equal measure," Kurethel replied, turning to look at him with those striking violet eyes. "We just committed to building a life together despite barely knowing each other, despite coming from different species with different lifespans and cultural expectations, despite political complications that are going to make everything harder. Any sane person would call this reckless. Good thing neither of us is particularly sane," Marcus said. "We can be reckless together." Kurethel laughed, and Marcus was starting to collect those laughs like treasures. They sat together on the balcony overlooking the capital city, watching 3 moons rise over architecture that seemed to grow from the ground, while below the celebration continued in their honor. "What happens now?" Marcus asked, the question he'd been asking repeatedly because the answer kept changing. "Now," Kurethel said, "we figure out how to actually build a life together. How to balance my responsibilities as heir with your work as cultural liaison. how to navigate my mother's expectations and your government's concerns, how to deal with nobles who think you're unworthy and humans who think you've betrayed your species, how to learn each other's languages, literal and metaphorical, well enough to communicate when things get difficult. She took his hand, the gesture becoming natural. It's going to be complicated and challenging and sometimes probably miserable. There will be days when the cultural differences feel insurmountable and the political pressure unbearable. Days when you miss Earth and I miss the simplicity of ruling alone. Days when we wonder if this was a mistake. But, Marcus prompted, hearing the but in her voice. But I'd rather figure it out with you than stay safely lonely. I'd rather have the complication and challenge and uncertainty with someone who sees me than continue being isolated at the top. You stepped forward when no one else would, Marcus. That means something. That means we try. Marcus squeezed her hand. Then we try, and when it's hard, which it will be, we keep trying. And when I inevitably make terrible cultural errors, which I definitely will, you patiently explain what I did wrong and hopefully laugh about it instead of having me arrested. I'll consider it, Curethel said with mock severity. But I'm making no promises. Some of your cultural errors might be arrest-worthy. Fair, Marcus agreed. They sat beneath alien stars and unfamiliar moons, two people from different worlds who'd found each other through courage and honesty and the willingness to be vulnerable. The future stretched ahead full of complications and challenges and uncertainties. Political pressure would come, from both their governments, from noble factions, from people who thought this union was wrong for various reasons. Cultural differences would create friction. They'd need to learn how to communicate across not just language but fundamental worldview gaps. Practical realities would intrude, questions about where they'd live, how they'd balance their respective duties, what their life together would actually look like beyond the romantic gesture of completing trials. But in that moment, sitting together in the quiet after the ceremony, Marcus and Curethel were just two people beginning something neither could have predicted. One had stepped forward when no one else would. One had been hoping for 3 years that someone would. And together, they were choosing to try building connection across impossible distances, to risk vulnerability for the possibility of genuine partnership, to be brave enough to reach across species and culture, and all the practical barriers towards something that might become love. Below them, the celebration continued. Earth Command was definitely composing strongly worded messages. The Xylar court was already gossiping about the human who won the princess. And across the empire, the story was spreading, about the cultural attaché who volunteered for impossible trials, because he thought someone remarkable deserved at least one person willing to try. But on the balcony, Marcus and Curethel were just holding hands and talking quietly about everything and nothing, beginning to learn each other, starting to build something fragile and precious that would take work and patience and courage to maintain. Thank you, Curethel said softly, for being brave enough to step forward, for seeing me when everyone else saw only reputation, for being willing to try even knowing how complicated this would be. Thank you, Marcus replied, for accepting the suit of an obviously unprepared human who mostly improvised his way through your trials, for laughing at my jokes when you probably should have had me removed for inappropriate behavior, for being worth the risk. They stayed there until the first moon set, and then they went inside to face whatever came next, together, which made all the difference.